This is an audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography,
produced and narrated by Giribala Joshi.
Chapter 11, 1921 and the First Imprisonment. 1921 was an extraordinary year for us. There was a strange mixture of nationalism and politics and religion and mysticism and fanaticism. Behind all this was agrarian trouble and, in the big cities, a rising working-class movement. Nationalism and a vague but intense countrywide idealism sought to bring together all these various and sometimes mutually contradictory discontents and succeeded to a remarkable degree. And yet this nationalism itself was a composite force, and behind it could be distinguished a Hindu nationalism, a Muslim nationalism partly looking beyond the frontiers of India, and, what was more in consonance with the spirit of the times, an Indian nationalism. For the time being they overlapped and all pulled together. It was
Hindu Musalman ki jai
everywhere. It was remarkable how Gandhiji seemed to cast a spell on all classes and groups of people and drew them into one motley crowd struggling in one direction. He became, indeed, to use a phrase which has been applied to another leader, a symbolic expression of the confused desires of the people. Even more remarkable was the fact that these desires and passions were relatively free from hatred of the alien rulers against whom they were directed. Nationalism is essentially an anti-feeling, and it feeds and fattens on hatred and anger against other national groups and especially against the foreign rulers of a subject country. There was certainly this hatred and anger in India in 1921 against the British, but in comparison with other countries similarly situated, it was extraordinarily little. Undoubtedly, this was due to Gandhiji's insistence on the implications of nonviolence. It was also due to the feeling of release and power that came to the whole country with the inauguration of the movement and the widespread belief in success in the near future. Why be angry and full of hate when we were doing so well and were likely to win through soon? We felt that we could afford to be generous. We were not so generous in our hearts, though our actions were circumspect and proper, towards the handful of our own countrymen who took sides against us and opposed the national movement. It was not a question of hatred or anger, for they carried no weight whatever and we could ignore them. But deep within us was contempt for their weakness and opportunism and betrayal of national honor and self-respect. So we went on, vaguely but intensely, the exhilaration of action holding us in its grip. But about our goal there was an entire absence of clear thinking. It seems surprising now how completely we ignored the theoretical aspects, the philosophy of our movement, as well as the definite objective that we should have. Of course we all grew eloquent about Swaraj, but each one of us probably interpreted the word in his or her own way. To most of the younger men it meant political independence or something like it, and a democratic form of government, and we said so in our public utterances. Many of us also thought that inevitably this would result in a lessening of the burdens that crushed the workers and the peasantry, but it was obvious that to most of our leaders Swaraj meant something much less than independence. Gandhiji was delightfully vague on the subject, and he did not encourage clear thinking about it either. But he always spoke, vaguely but definitely, in terms of the underdog, and this brought great comfort to many of us, although at the same time he was full of assurances to the top dog also. Gandhiji's stress was never on the intellectual approach to a problem, but on character and piety. He did succeed amazingly in giving backbone and character to the Indian people. There were many, however, who developed neither much backbone nor character, but who imagined that a limp body and a flabby look might be the outward semblance of piety. It was this extraordinary stiffening up of the masses that filled us with confidence. A demoralized, backward and broken up people suddenly straightened their backs and lifted their heads and took part in disciplined, joint action on a country-wide scale. This action itself, we felt, would give irresistible power to the masses. We ignored the necessity of thought behind the action. We forgot that without a conscious ideology and objective, the energy and enthusiasm of the masses must end largely in smoke. To some extent, the revivalist element in our movement carried us on. A feeling that non-violence as conceived for political or economic movements or for righting wrongs was a new message which our people were destined to give to the world. We became victims to the curious illusion of all peoples and all nations that in some way they are a chosen race. Non-violence was the moral equivalent of war and of all violent struggle. It was not merely an ethical alternative, but it was effective also. Few of us, I think, accepted Gandhiji's old ideas about machinery and modern civilization. We thought that even he looked upon them as utopian and as largely inapplicable to modern conditions. Certainly most of us were not prepared to reject the achievements of modern civilization, although we may have felt that some variation to suit Indian conditions was possible. Personally, I have always felt attracted towards big machinery and fast traveling. Still, there can be no doubt that Gandhiji's ideology influenced many people and made them critical of the machine and all its consequences. So, while some looked to the future, others looked back to the past, and curiously, both felt that the joint action they were indulging in was worthwhile, and this made it easy to bear sacrifice and face self-denial. I became wholly absorbed and wrapped in the movement, and large numbers of other people did likewise. I gave up all my other associations and contacts, old friends, books, even newspapers, except in so far as they dealt with the work in hand. I had kept up till then some reading of current books and had tried to follow the developments of world affairs. But there was no time for this now. In spite of the strength of my family bonds, I almost forgot my family, my wife, my daughter. It was only long afterwards that I realized what a burden and a trial I must have been to them in those days, and what amazing patience and tolerance my wife had shown towards me. I lived in offices and committee meetings and crowds. Go to the villages was the slogan, and we trudged many a mile across fields and visited distant villages and addressed peasant meetings. I experienced the thrill of mass feeling, the power of influencing the mass. I began to understand a little the psychology of the crowd, the difference between the city masses and the peasantry, and I felt at home in the dust and discomfort, the pushing and jostling of large gatherings, though their want of discipline often irritated me. Since those days I have sometimes had to face hostile and angry crowds, worked up to a state when a spark would light a flame, and I found that that early experience and the confidence it begot in me stood me in good stead. Always I went straight to the crowd and trusted it, and so far I have always had courtesy and appreciation from it, even though there was no agreement. But crowds are fickle, and the future may have different experiences in store for me. I took to the crowd and the crowd took to me, and yet I never lost myself in it. Always I felt apart from it. From my separate mental perch I looked at it critically, and I never ceased to wonder how I, who was so different in every way from those thousands who surrounded me, different in habits, in desires, in mental and spiritual outlook, how I had managed to reign goodwill and a measure of confidence from these people. Was it because they took me for something other than I was? Would they bear with me when they knew me better? Was I gaining their goodwill under false pretenses? I tried to be frank and straightforward to them. I even spoke harshly to them sometimes, and criticized many of their pet beliefs and customs, but still they put up with me, and yet I could not get rid of the idea that their affection was meant not for me as I was, but for some fanciful image of me that they had formed. How long could that false image endure? And why should it be allowed to endure? And when it fell down and they saw the reality, what then? I am vain enough in many ways, but there could be no question of vanity with these crowds of simple folk. There was no posing about them, no vulgarity, as in the case of many of us of the middle classes who consider ourselves their betters. They were dull, certainly, uninteresting individually, but in the mass they produced a feeling of overwhelming pity and a sense of ever-impending tragedy. Very different were our conferences where our chosen workers, including myself, performed on the platform. There was sufficient posing there and no lack of vulgarity in our flamboyant addresses. All of us must have been to some extent guilty of this, but some of the minor Khilafat leaders probably led the rest. It is not easy to behave naturally on a platform before a large audience, and few of us had previous experience of such publicity. So we tried to look as, we imagined, leaders should look, thoughtful and serious, with no trace of levity or frivolity. When we walked or talked or smiled, we were conscious of thousands of eyes staring at us, and we reacted accordingly. Our speeches were often very eloquent, but equally often singularly pointless. It is difficult to see oneself as others see one. And so, unable to criticize myself, I took to watching carefully the ways of others, and I found considerable amusement in this occupation. And then the terrible thought would strike me that I might perhaps appear equally ludicrous to others. Right through the year 1921 individual Congress workers were being arrested and sentenced, but there were no mass arrests.
The Ali brothers
Had received long sentences for inciting the Indian army to disaffection. Their words for which they had been sentenced were repeated at hundreds of platforms by thousands of persons. I was threatened in the summer with proceedings for sedition because of some speeches I had delivered. No such step, however, was taken then. The end of the year brought matters to a head. The Prince of Wales was coming to India, and the Congress had proclaimed a boycott of all the functions in connection with his visit. Towards the end of November, the Congress volunteers in Bengal were declared illegal, and this was followed by a similar declaration for the United Provinces.
Deshbandhu Das
Gave a stirring message to Bengal. I feel the handcuffs on my wrists and the weight of iron chains on my body. It is the agony of bondage. The whole of India is a vast prison. The work of the Congress must be carried on. What matters it whether I am taken or left? What matters it whether I am dead or alive? In the UP, we took up the challenge and not only announced that our volunteer organization would continue to function, but published lists of names of volunteers in the daily newspapers. The first list was headed by my father's name. He was not a volunteer, but simply for the purpose of defying the government order, he joined and gave his name. Early in December, a few days before the prince came to our province, mass arrests began. We knew that matters had at last come to a head. The inevitable conflict between the Congress and the government was about to break out. Prison was still an unknown place, the idea of going there still a novelty. I was sitting rather late one day in the Congress office at Allahabad, trying to clear up arrears of work. An excited clerk told me that the police had come with a search warrant and were surrounding the office building. I was, of course, a little excited also, for it was my first experience of the kind, but the desire to show off was strong, the wish to appear perfectly cool and collected, unaffected by the comings and goings of the police. So I asked a clerk to accompany the police officer in his search round the office rooms and insisted on the rest of the staff carrying on their usual work and ignoring the police. A little later, a friend and a colleague who had been arrested just outside the office came to me, accompanied by a policeman, to bid me good-bye. I was so full of the conceit that I must treat these novel occurrences as everyday happenings that I treated my colleague in a most unfeeling manner. Casually, I asked him and the policeman to wait till I had finished the letter I was writing. Soon news came of other arrests in the city. I decided at last to go home and see what was happening there. I found the inevitable police searching part of the large house, and learnt that they had come to arrest both father and me. Nothing that we could have done would have fitted in so well with our program of boycotting the prince's visit. Wherever he was taken, he was met with hartals and deserted streets. Allahabad, when he came, seemed to be a city of the dead. Calcutta, a few days later, suddenly put a temporary stop to all the activities of a great city. It was hard on the Prince of Wales. He was not to blame, and there was no feeling against him whatever. But the government of India had tried to exploit his personality to prop up their decaying prestige. There was an orgy of arrests and convictions, especially in the United Provinces and in Bengal. All the prominent Congress leaders and workers in these provinces were arrested, and ordinary volunteers by the thousand went to prison. They were, at first, largely city men, and there seemed to be an inexhaustible supply of volunteers for prison. The UP Provincial Congress Committee was arrested en bloc, 55 members, as they were actually holding a committee meeting. Many people who had so far taken no part in any congress or political activity were carried away by the wave of enthusiasm and insisted on being arrested. There were cases of government clerks, returning from their offices in the evening, being swept away by this current and landing in jail instead of their homes. Young men and boys would crowd inside the police lorries and refuse to come out. Every evening we could hear from inside the jail, lorry after lorry arriving outside, heralded by our slogans and shouts. The jails were crowded, and the jail officials were at their wits' ends at this extraordinary phenomenon. It happened sometimes that a police lorry would bring, according to the warrant accompanying it, a certain number of prisoners. No names were or could be mentioned. Actually, a larger number than that mentioned would emerge from the lorry, and the jail officials did not know how to meet this novel situation. There was nothing in the jail manual about it. Gradually, the government gave up the policy of indiscriminate arrests. Only noted workers were picked out. Gradually, also the first flush of enthusiasm of the people cooled down, and, owing to the absence in prison of all the trusted workers, a feeling of indecision and helplessness spread. But the change was superficial only, and there was still thunder in the air, and the atmosphere was tense and pregnant with revolutionary possibilities. During the months of December 1921 and January 1922, it is estimated that about 30,000 persons were sentenced to imprisonment in connection with the non-cooperation movement. But though most of the prominent men and workers were in prison, the leader of the whole struggle, Mahatma Gandhi, was still out, issuing from day to day messages and directions which inspired the people, as well as checking many an undesirable activity. The government had not touched him so far, for they feared the consequences, the reactions on the Indian Army and the police. Suddenly, early in February 1922, the whole scene shifted, and we in prison learnt, to our amazement and consternation, that Gandhiji had stopped the aggressive aspects of our struggle, that he had suspended civil resistance. We read that this was because of what had happened near the village of Chorichora, where a mob of villagers had retaliated on some policemen by setting fire to the police station and burning half a dozen or so policemen in it. We were angry when we learnt of this stoppage of our struggle at a time when we seemed to be consolidating our position and advancing on all fronts. But our disappointment and anger in prison could do little good to anyone, and civil resistance stopped and non-cooperation wilted away. After many months of strain and anxiety, the government breathed again, and for the first time had the opportunity of taking the initiative. A few weeks later, they arrested Gandhiji and sentenced him for a long term of imprisonment. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12. Non-Violence and the Doctrine of the Sword. The sudden suspension of our movement after the Chorichora incident was resented, I think, by almost all the prominent Congress leaders, other than Gandhiji, of course. My father, who was in jail at the time, was much upset by it. The younger people were naturally even more agitated. Our mounting hopes tumbled to the ground, and this mental reaction was to be expected. What troubled us even more were the reasons given for this suspension and the consequences that seemed to flow from them. Chorichora may have been and was a deplorable occurrence and wholly opposed to the spirit of the non-violent movement. But were a remote village and a mob of excited peasants in an out-of-the-way place going to put an end, for some time at least, to our national struggle for freedom? If this was the inevitable consequence of a sporadic act of violence, then surely there was something lacking in the philosophy and technique of a non-violent struggle. For it seemed to us to be impossible to guarantee against the occurrence of some such untoward incident. Must we train the 300 and odd millions of India in the theory and practice of non-violent action before we could go forward? And even so, how many of us could say that under extreme provocation from the police we would be able to remain perfectly peaceful? But even if we succeeded, what of the numerous agents provocateurs, stool pigeons and the like who crept into our movement and indulged in violence themselves or induced others to do so. If this was the sole condition of its function, then the non-violent method of resistance would always fail. We had accepted that method, the Congress had made that method its own, because of a belief in its effectiveness. Gandhiji had placed it before the country not only as the right method, but as the most effective one for our purpose. In spite of its negative name, it was a dynamic method, the very opposite of a meek submission to a tyrant's will. It was not a coward's refuge from action, but the brave man's defiance of evil and national subjection. But what was the use of the bravest and the strongest if a few odd persons, maybe even our opponents in the guise of friends, had the power to upset or end our movement by their rash behavior? Gandhiji had pleaded for the adoption of the way of non-violence, of peaceful non-cooperation, with all the eloquence and persuasive power which he so abundantly possessed. His language had been simple and unadorned, his voice and appearance cool and clear and devoid of all emotion, but behind that outward covering of ice there was the heat of a blazing fire and concentrated passion, and the words he uttered winged their way to the innermost recesses of our minds and hearts, and created a strange ferment there. The way he pointed out was hard and difficult, but it was a brave path, and it seemed to lead to the promised land of freedom. Because of that promise we pledged our faith and marched ahead. In a famous article, The Doctrine of the Sword, he had written in 1920, "I do believe that when there is only a choice between cowardice and violence, I would advise violence. I would rather have India resort to arms in order to defend her honor than that she should, in a cowardly manner, become or remain a helpless victim to her own dishonor. But I believe that non-violence is infinitely superior to violence. Forgiveness is more manly than punishment. Forgiveness adorns a soldier, but abstinence is forgiveness only when there is power to punish. It is meaningless when it pretends to proceed from a helpless creature. A mouse hardly forgives a cat when it allows itself to be torn to pieces by her. But I do not believe India to be helpless. I do not believe myself to be a helpless creature. Let me not be misunderstood. Strength does not come from physical capacity, it comes from an indomitable will. I am not a visionary. I claim to be a practical idealist. The religion of non-violence is not meant merely for the rishis and saints. It is meant for the common people as well. Non-violence is the law of our species, as violence is the law of the brute. The spirit lies dormant in the brute, and he knows no law but that of physical might. The dignity of man requires obedience to a higher law, to the strength of the spirit. I have therefore ventured to place before India the ancient law of self-sacrifice. For Satyagraha and its offshoots, non-cooperation and civil resistance, are nothing but new names for the law of suffering. The rishis who discovered the law of non-violence in the midst of violence were greater geniuses than Newton. They were themselves greater warriors than Wellington. Having themselves known the use of arms, they realized their uselessness and taught a weary world that its salvation lay not through violence but through non-violence. Non-violence in its dynamic condition means conscious suffering. It does not mean meek submission to the will of the evildoer, but it means the putting of one's whole soul against the will of the tyrant. Working under this law of our being, it is possible for a single individual to defy the whole might of an unjust empire, to save his honor, his religion, his soul, and lay the foundation for that empire's fall or regeneration. And so I am not pleading for India to practice non-violence because it is weak. I want her to practice non-violence being conscious of her strength and power. I want India to recognize that she has a soul that cannot perish and that can rise triumphant above any physical weakness and defy the physical combination of a whole world. I isolate this non-cooperation from Sinfinism, for it is so conceived as to be incapable of being offered side by side with violence. But I invite even the school of violence to give this peaceful non-cooperation a trial. It will not fail through its inherent weakness. It may fail because of poverty of response. Then will be the time for real danger. the high-souled men who are unable to suffer national humiliation any longer will want to vent their wrath. They will take to violence. So far as I know, they must perish without delivering themselves or their country from the wrong. If India takes up the doctrine of the sword, she may gain momentary victory. Then India will cease to be the pride of my heart. I am wedded to India because I owe my all to her. I believe absolutely that she has a mission for the world. End of the extract from Gandhi's Doctrine of the Sword. We were moved by these arguments, but for us and for the National Congress as a whole, the non-violent method was not, and could not be, a religion or an unchallengeable creed or dogma. It could only be a policy and a method promising certain results, and by those results it would have to be finally judged. Individuals might make of it a religion or incontrovertible creed, but no political organization, so long as it remained political, could do so. Chauri Chaura and its consequences made us examine these implications of non-violence as a method, and we felt that if Gandhiji's argument for the suspension of civil resistance was correct, our opponents would always have the power to create circumstances which would necessarily result in our abandoning the struggle. Was this the fault of the non-violent method itself, or of Gandhiji's interpretation of it? After all, he was the author and originator of it, and who could be a better judge of what it was and what it was not? And without him, where was our movement? Many years later, just before the 1930 civil disobedience movement began, Gandhiji, much to our satisfaction, made this point clear. He stated that the movement should not be abandoned because of the occurrence of sporadic acts of violence. If the non-violent method of struggle could not function because of such almost inevitable happenings, then it was obvious that it was not an ideal method for all occasions, and this he was not prepared to admit. For him, the method, being the right method, should suit all circumstances and should be able to function, at any rate in a restricted way, even in a hostile atmosphere. Whether this interpretation, which widened the scope of non-violent action, represented an evolution in his own mind or not, I do not know. As a matter of fact, even the suspension of civil resistance in February 1922 was certainly not due to Chauri Chaura alone, although most people imagined so. That was only the last straw. Gandhiji has often acted almost by instinct. By long and close association with the masses he appears to have developed, as great popular leaders often do, a new sense which tells him how the mass feels, what it does, and what it can do. He reacts to this instinctive feeling and fashions his action accordingly, and later, for the benefit of his surprised and resentful colleagues, tries to clothe his decision with reasons. This covering is often very inadequate, as it seemed after Chauri Chaura. At that time, our movement, in spite of its apparent power and the widespread enthusiasm, was going to pieces. All organization and discipline was disappearing. Almost all our good men were in prison, and the masses had so far received little training to carry on by themselves. Any unknown man who wanted to do so could take charge of a Congress committee, and as a matter of fact, large numbers of undesirable men, including agents provocateurs, came to the front and even controlled some local Congress and Khilafat organizations. There was no way of checking them. This kind of thing is, of course, to some extent almost inevitable in such a struggle. The leaders must take the lead in going to prison, and trust to others to carry on. All that can be done is to train the masses in some simple kinds of activity, and, even more so, to abstain from certain other kinds of activity. In 1930, we had already spent several years in giving some such training, and the civil disobedience movement then, and in 1932, was a very powerful and organized affair. This was lacking in 1921 and 1922, and there was little behind the excitement and enthusiasm of the people. There is little doubt that if the movement had continued, there would have been growing sporadic violence in many places. This would have been crushed by government in a bloody manner, and a reign of terror established which would have thoroughly demoralized the people. These were probably the reasons and influences that worked in Gandhiji's mind, and granting his premises and the desirability of carrying on with the technique of non-violence, his decision was right. He had to stop the rot and build anew. From another and an entirely different viewpoint, his decision might be considered wrong, but that viewpoint had nothing to do with the non-violent method. It was not possible to have it both ways. To invite a bloody suppression of the movement in that particular sporadic way, and at that stage, would not, of course, have put an end to the national movement, for such movements have a way of rising from their ashes. Temporary setbacks are often helpful in clarifying issues and in giving backbone. What matters is not a setback or apparent defeat, but the principles and ideals. If these principles can be kept untarnished by the masses, then recovery comes soon. But what were our principles and objectives in 1921 and 1922? A vague Swaraj with no clear ideology behind it and a particular technique of non-violent struggle. The latter method would naturally have gone if the country had taken to sporadic violence on any big scale, and as to the former, there was little to hold on to. The people generally were not strong enough to carry on the struggle for long, and, in spite of almost universal discontent with foreign rule and sympathy with the Congress, there was not enough backbone or organization. They could not last. Even the crowds that went to prison did so on the spur of the moment, expecting the whole thing to be over very soon. It may be, therefore, that the decision to suspend civil resistance in 1922 was a right one, though the manner of doing it left much to be desired and brought about a certain demoralization. It is possible, however, that this sudden bottling up of a great movement contributed to a tragic development in the country. The drift to sporadic and futile violence in the political struggle was stopped, but the suppressed violence had to find a way out, and in the following years this perhaps aggravated the communal trouble. The communalists of various denominations, mostly political reactionaries, had been forced to lie low because of the overwhelming mass support for the non-cooperation and civil disobedience movement. They emerged now from their retirement. Many others, Secret Service agents and people who sought to please the authorities, creating communal friction, also worked on the same theme. The Mopla Rising and its extraordinarily cruel suppression. What a horrible thing was the baking to death of the Mopla prisoners in the closed railway vans, had already given a handle to those who stirred the waters of communal discord. It is just possible that if civil resistance had not been stopped and the movement had been crushed by government, there would have been less communal bitterness and less superfluous energy left for the subsequent communal riots. Before civil resistance was called off, an incident occurred which might have led to different results. The first wave of civil resistance amazed and frightened the government. It was then that Lord Reading, the Viceroy, said in a public speech that he was troubled and perplexed. The Prince of Wales was in India, and his presence added greatly to the government's responsibility. An attempt was made by the government in December 1921, soon after the mass arrests at the beginning of the month, to come to some understanding with the Congress. This was especially in view of the Prince's forthcoming visit to Calcutta. There were some informal talks between representatives of the Bengal government and Deshbandhu Das, who was in jail then. A proposal seems to have been made that a small round-table conference might take place between the government and the Congress. This proposal appears to have fallen through because Gandhiji insisted that Maulana Muhammad Ali, who was then in prison in Karachi, should be present at this conference. Government would not agree to this. Mr. C.R. Das did not approve of Gandhiji's attitude in this matter, and, when he came out of prison later, he publicly criticized him and said that he had blundered. Most of us, we were in jail, do not know the details of what took place then, and it is difficult to judge without all the facts. It seems, however, that little good could have come out of the conference at that stage. It was an effort on the part of government to tide over somehow the period of the Prince's visit to Calcutta. The basic problems that faced us would have remained. 9 years later, when the nation and the Congress were far stronger, such a conference took place without any great results. But apart from this, it seems to me that Gandhiji's insistence on Muhammad Ali's presence was perfectly justified. Not only as a Congress leader, but as the leader of the Khilafat movement, and the Khilafat question was then an important plank in the Congress program, his presence was essential. No policy or maneuver can ever be a right one if it involves the forsaking of a colleague. The fact that government were not prepared to release him from jail itself shows that there was no likelihood of any results from a conference. Both my father and I had been sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment on different charges and by different courts. The trials were farcical, and, as was our custom, we took no part in them. It was easy enough, of course, to find enough material in our speeches or other activities for a conviction, but the actual choice was amusing. Father was tried as a member of an illegal organization, the Congress Volunteers, and to prove this, a form with his signature in Hindi was produced. The signature was certainly his, but as it happened, he had hardly ever signed in Hindi before, and very few persons could recognize his Hindi signature. A tattered gentleman was then produced who swore to the signature. The man was quite illiterate, and he held the signature upside down when he examined it. My daughter, aged 4 at the time, had her first experience of the dock during father's trial, as he held her in his arms throughout. My offence was distributing notices for a hartal. This was no offence under the law then, though I believe it is one now, for we are rapidly advancing towards dominion status. However, I was sentenced. 3 months later I was informed in the prison where I was with my father and others that some revising authority had come to the conclusion that I was wrongly sentenced and I was to be discharged. I was surprised, as no one had taken any step on my behalf. The suspension of civil resistance had apparently galvanized the revising judges into activity. I was sorry to go out, leaving my father behind. I decided to go almost immediately to Gandhiji in Ahmedabad. Before I arrived there, he had been arrested, and my interview with him took place in Sabarmati prison. I was present at his trial. It was a memorable occasion, and those of us who were present are not likely ever to forget it. The judge, an Englishman, behaved with dignity and feeling. Gandhiji's statement to the court was a most moving one, and we came away emotionally stirred, and with the impress of his vivid phrases and striking images in our mind. I came back to Allahabad. I felt unhappy and lonely outside the prison when so many of my friends and colleagues were behind prison bars. I found that the Congress organization was not functioning well, and I tried to put it straight. In particular, I interested myself in the boycott of foreign cloth. This item of our program still continued in spite of the withdrawal of civil resistance. Nearly all the cloth merchants in Allahabad had pledged themselves not to import or purchase foreign cloth and had formed an association for the purpose. The rules of this association laid down that any infringement would be punished by a fine. I found that several of the big dealers had broken their pledges and were importing foreign cloth. This was very unfair to those who stuck to their pledges. We remonstrated with little result, and the Cloth Dealers Association seemed to be powerless to take action. So we decided to picket the shops of the erring merchants. Even a hint of picketing was enough for our purpose. Fines were paid, pledges were taken afresh. The money from the fines went to the Cloth Merchants Association. 2 or 3 days later I was arrested, together with a number of colleagues who had taken part in the negotiations with the merchants. We were charged with criminal intimidation and extortion. I was further charged with some other offences, including sedition. I did not defend myself, but I made a long statement in court. I was sentenced on at least 3 counts, including intimidation and extortion, but the sedition charge was not proceeded with, as it was probably considered that I had already got as much as I deserved. As far as I remember, there were 3 sentences, 2 of which were for 18 months and were concurrent. In all, I think, I was sentenced to 1 year and 9 months. That was my second sentence. I went back to prison after about 6 weeks spent outside it. End of chapter 12.